My name is Colleen McCormick Akey. I'm a nurse anesthetist, and as you said, I have a master's degree in bioethics, and I also have some experiences in how this plays out from Vermont, where I was on the faculty of the medical college and a clinical practitioner for 17 years. So, first of all, I want to say we are hearing a lot of words, combination, merger. Legally, this is an acquisition. If it were not an acquisition, it would not be in the Attorney General's office. So this, you can call, people put names on it, names that make it sound like it's something less than it is, but it is an acquisition of Catholic Medical Center by Dartmouth Hitchcock. That's the legal reality. And people have talked about the board, the distribution of the board. I just want to mention one thing before I forget. If you haven't had a chance to read the definitive agreement, the bishop can't even understand somebody signing a contract that says, if I or any of my successors, we have no recourse if you violate this contract. If we endeavor to rescind the contract, to get out of the contract, you have our permission to sue us. Who would you advise somebody to sign a contract that says you can sue me if you break the contract and I decide I don't want to be in the contract with you anymore? Would you advise a client to sign that? I can't even imagine, Plus, it hamstrings future bishops who may have a very different point of view. What happened in Vermont? In 1973, I was a licensed practical nurse. A merger had already begun. It was actually done in a gradual way. There were two very major hospitals, tertiary care hospitals on the Hill in Burlington, Vermont. One was the Mary Fletcher Hospital, where I worked, and one was the Bishop de Gosbriand Hospital, where my roommate worked. And both hospitals were equivalent. They both had inpatient, outpatient, surgery, intensive care unit, you name it, they did it. They were staffed by both local physicians and private practice who now have been almost entirely driven out of the Burlington area, as well as physicians from the medical college. So their staffing was in both places. They were really staffed by the same people. So they had a merger, and for several years, they both continued to practice independently of one another. A decision was made and negotiated that they were going to close down the ORs at Bishop de Gosbriand, turn it into a medical office building. They had a rehab center there, and they had outpatient x-ray and laboratory. So all the really truly hospital parts of the facility were no longer a hospital. There were no inpatient beds except for rehab or nursing home type beds. But there were no acute care beds. There was no longer any surgery, nothing. About the time that they did this, there was an agreement forged to the original agreement that nothing that violated Catholic teaching would ever happen on the campus of the University of Vermont Hospital, in that hospital. I went in the Navy. I was hospital corpsman. They put me through nursing school. I got out and I used the GI Bill to go to anesthesia training, graduate school. And I came back as a nurse anesthetist in 1987. So from my perspective, I'm looking at it as a secular facility. So I just assumed that they were doing abortions. So when I interviewed for the job, I told Dr. Mazuzin, the chairman of anesthesia, I was like, I don't do that. I won't have any part. He's like, that's no problem, not really a big problem. He said, most of that gets referred to Planned Parenthood. Most of. Okay. So, but I had to excuse myself, and like everything, it gradually changes. First, it was like, no problem, we'll put those patients in other rooms. And then somebody would get transferred into my room. No problem, we'll switch somebody else in to do the case. And then it became, you have to find somebody to cover that case if you don't want to do it. over time. So just moving down the road, the slippery slope, I started my master's in bioethics in 2001. And I was embraced into the bioethics community by a Christian physician who had been hired from Loma Linda, California, Dr. Robert Orr, to chair the ethics, all the ethics activities at UVM. When I went and introduced myself and we began to work on, and I got invited onto clinical ethics committee, I was on the institutional ethics advisory committee, and I was also asked to teach some classes at the medical school. When all this happened, when we were first introduced, Bob Orr said to me, he was an evangelical, he said, the reason I took this job is because they don't do abortions here. From the clinical side, that was what he was told. From the clinical side, knew that we did do abortions there because I had to be excused from elective abortions. And not only did we do elective abortions in the OR in the first trimester, up on labor and delivery, they asked us to put in and manage epidurals for late-term abortions in the labor and delivery suite so the women would not be uncomfortable during their late-term procedure, because obviously a bigger baby is harder to labor and deliver, and the technique creates a lot of cramping and is a very uncomfortable technique. So they were doing abortions in the OR, they were doing abortions on labor and delivery. They had an in vitro fertilization program where they would sometimes implant up to 15 fertilized eggs, knowing that they have a very low chance of all of them surviving. But if more than twins survive, it was a contractual part of the agreement, because I had a friend who was a nurse who had in vitro, that you would allow them to selectively reduce all but 2 babies. She carried triplets. And they said to her, which one? They came to her and said, which one do you want us to eliminate? And she said, I've been trying for 15 years to get pregnant. You're not eliminating anybody. And they said, you signed a contract. She persevered, though, and she did have her triplets. But again, with the in vitro fertilization, there is a selective, they do implant a large number, knowing that most of them won't survive. And then if many do survive, then they go to the mother, and it's contractual that she will have some of them eliminated to make, because it keeps their statistics looking good. Okay, so they have more healthy babies and more healthy mommies. So just a few years later than that, they decided they wanted to acquire the Fanny Allen Hospital, which is in Essex Junction, Winooski area. It's a little more peripheral, but in Burlington, those were really the 3 hospitals. It was also a Catholic hospital run by the Sister Hospitaliers of St. Joseph out of Montreal, as was the first one. Whoops. Oops. So they were acquired. The sister who was the CEO was tasked with monitoring what was going on at the big hospital. And so it turns out that I found out later, I was in a lecture hall, and the physician who was lecturing was saying how he was lamenting how they couldn't do abortions anywhere on UVM campus because of the relationship with the Catholic facilities. And I corrected him on that, and he said, well, it has to go under review. The case has to go under review. And I had been in an OR one day where a patient was brought up from the ER to the OR from shortly after she was seen in the ER for an elective termination. And I heard the whole discussion between the physician and the resident. They put her on right after the patient that I was taking care of in another room. And so I said, I've seen him come from the ER. I said, there was no time for review. And he looked down at his paper and he said to me, kind of embarrassedly, the review's done posthumously. After the doctor terminates, they review it and say that it was proper. And then they submit their report how the termination was proper to the Catholic authorities for review. So when I went to the sister about the whole thing, she was very interested about Bishop Angel. I actually I wrote letters to the head of the medical school because I was teaching there, And these discussions were going on in the classroom to, I copied to the chairman of my department, copied to the OB/GYN anesthesiologist, who was a specialty, and Bishop Angel, who was a bishop at the time, Sister Ducheneau. Sister Ducheneau was very interested. She said, I thought the numbers had been going up, and I was sort of wondering about that. Shortly thereafter, University of Vermont announced that they were thinking that maybe they would just close the operating rooms at the Fanny Allen Hospital. They probably didn't need them anymore. And all of a sudden, Sister Irene lost all interest in investigating this. And the bishop, he and she had a talk, and they asked me, and I never at the time went public with any of this. I did it all very, everybody got a confidential letter about it when I tried to bring up the fact that on paper and in interviewing ethicists for positions, they're saying we don't do it, and they're teaching the medical school we don't do it, although sooner or later somebody must realize when they get into their clinicals that they do it, that all the while they were doing elective abortions. So this is 2019, so this is how far we've come. The Office of Civil Rights of the Health and Human Services Department of the United States government issues a notice of violation to the University of Vermont Medical Center after it unlawfully forced a nurse to assist in an abortion. So we've gone from we don't do that here to you will assist or you will lose your job. And when they collected evidence, she was not the only one who had been coerced at the risk of loss of her job. So they started that investigation in August of 2019, or they released their report. But in November of 2019, a federal judge halted the Trump administration conscience protection rule. So where it will go, there are a number of people. There are people in the state of New Hampshire who have conscience protection suits filed with HHS against Dartmouth Hitchcock. Whether they will ever see the light of day, I don't know. But what this points to is we are in a culture war. We have been in a culture war for decades, and we foolishly try to pretend that we're not in a culture war. But it is ubiquitous. I mean, you know, watch the nightly news. You know, watch what happens in Washington. Watch, HHS tries to protect somebody's conscience, and then a federal judge says, no, you can't protect their conscience rights. And where it will go, nobody knows. Who's going to be elected next? Who's going to be elected after that? Where would we even be having this discussion if it weren't, if Trump hadn't been elected? Because conscience rights would have already been abrogated, right? Or already been snatched. So we have to understand, John Paul II said it in the 1990s, there is a culture of death, a pervasive culture of death. And we are supposed to be the culture of life. And the culture of death is most highly represented in healthcare. Where else? Where do people go to live and die? They go to the hospital or the hospice organization. And I could tell you stories about Dartmouth Hitchcock's hospice organization, but we don't have time. But we're in a battle. There's a culture of life and a culture of death. If we allow the Catholic Medical Center to go any farther down the road, and it is already in violation of a lot of moral teaching of the Catholic Church, but if we allow them to continue down this road, if we allow Dartmouth Hitchcock to acquire them, then at some point in time, we're going to wonder, where do I go to work where I can do my job without being forced to participate in something I have a moral objection to? And people will be wondering, where do I go to get care if I'm seriously ill without somebody wanting to pull my feeding tube because I'm not healing fast enough, right? So people will not know where to go. The child in Texas, right, 11-month-old child, and the courts agree with the doctors go to court. Of course, they look, and the parents are probably fairly hysterical. They want their child to have a chance to survive, and the doctors are very businesslike and academic, and they make a very good show, and they say, but look, who was the girl in Boston? They took her from her parents for over a year, and she went back far worse condition than she had left. Justina Pelletier. The doctors went to court. The doctors went to court and got custody of that girl. She was actually assaulted in the care of the state, and she went from walking, skating, socially interactive to being wheelchair bound in the year that she was with the state of Massachusetts. So you have to understand that the thing about Catholic healthcare, and this was brought out very, very well, is Jesus sent the disciples forth to heal and to preach and evangelize. And it was never about being corporate capitalist organization, paying people, everybody with an O after their name makes 200 times the salary of an average employee. That's not the Catholic image. That's not the Christian image. Catholic healthcare was to a mission and a ministry to people. And just like going to church on Sunday, nobody charges admission at the door. Those who have contribute generously. Those who have not give what they can, or if they can't, they don't. But and it's not being charitable because you get government money for taking care of people instead of being charitable. That's not charity. Is okay, well, we'll take care of you because the government will give us money. Charity is we will take care of you no matter what, and we will know that that in the big picture, because of who we are as a church, as a people, everybody who needs care will get the care they need, and we'll all pitch in to see to it that people are cared for. So that's the pro-life position.